Are you wondering how much you need in order to retire? Well, today we finally will assign a number to that approximation as we continue on to step 4 of the retirement planning process. All right, we are back for another episode of A Worthwhile Retirement. I am Jacob George, excited to continue through our 7-step retirement planning process. But before we do, remember that this information is general in nature, not intended to be taken as specific investment, legal, or tax advice for you and your situation. I decided to leave out the music that typically plays behind me during the topic of the day. I feel that it would be perhaps less distracting to have some music behind the voice. Usually when you have a conversation, there is no music in the background. If you are disappointed by that in any way, then let me know. If you didn't even notice there was music at all, then there is no change. All right, the retirement planning process. So far, step 1, we have defined what we want retirement to look like for us personally. Step 2, we have estimated our approximate income need in that retirement. And step 3, we have factored in guaranteed income sources into that equation, like pensions and Social Security. So now what? Well, today we start answering the question that people typically think about when it comes to retirement, and that is, how much money do I need? How much in total do I need to have saved before I can retire? And to figure that out, we need to do some math. And while I am not going to walk through that particular calculation in this podcast, I think that'd be hard to think through in this format. I have linked to an article in the episode description that highlights the present value calculations that I use to get to these answers. You don't need to be able to do these by hand. Retirement planning software will obviously do this for you if you use New Retirement or have a Right Capital account through an advisor. But if you wanted to do it by hand, I say by hand, with a calculator, then that article is there for you. Again, I'm not going to get into that calculation now, but I did think it might be useful to go over some examples. So we're going to take a look at one. So imagine a couple named Steve and Susie Smith. Steve and Susie are both 60 years old, and they want their money to last them until they are 90, 30 years. And they're wondering if they have enough to retire. They project spending $10,000 a month or $120K a year. They have no pension at all, but they do intend on delaying their Social Security benefits until they are age 70, and they estimate receiving about $5,000 a month, so half of their income need from that point on. A couple more data points that I will use. I'm going to assume their portfolio returns 8% annually, and I'm going to assume an inflation rate of 4%. So just a touch on the conservative side. How much do you think they would need to have saved before day 1 of retirement? Using these data points alone. Again, a 30-year retirement beginning at age 60, spending $10,000 a month, and starting at age 70, receiving $5,000 a month in Social Security. A market return of 8% and inflation of 4%. How much do you think they would need to have saved before day 1 of retirement can begin? I will give you just a second before I reveal the answer. But keep in mind, this is a pretty basic calculation. There's a lot we are not going to factor in, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But with what we do know, the answer is approximately 1.6 million. I'm obviously doing a little rounding there. But that would be their number. And I want to use that number as a baseline as we manipulate the data points. So for example, let's say Steve and Susie don't really want to spend $10,000 a month, and they're perfectly happy getting along on $8,000 a month. Now, how much do they need to retire? Well, a little less than $1.2 million. A pretty big difference. But let's say Steve and Susie decide they actually want to spend more in retirement, $12,000 a month. Now how much do they need? Well, a little over $2 million. So again, if they were to spend $8,000 a month, they'd need just under $1.2 million. $10,000 a month, they would need $1.6 million. And $12,000 a month, they would need a little over $2 million. Now let's toggle a different data point. Go back to that $10,000 a month baseline, but now pretend that they're 55 years old making this decision. Am I ready to retire? But their time frame still goes to 90. So they're retiring 5 years sooner. How much more do they need instead of that $1.6 million figure? The answer to retire 5 years sooner is $1.9 million. And let's push that further and say they both have long family histories of longevity. And they want to see how much they need if they live until they're 95 years old. So now they're looking at a 40-year retirement. How much do they need? Well, we jump from 1.9 million to 1.97 million. And isn't that interesting? To retire 5 years sooner, we went from 1.6 to 1.9. But for retirement to last them 5 years longer, we just go from 1.9 to 1.97. Now, why do you think that is? Because those additional 5 years were 5 years that they were receiving Social Security benefits. And not only that, but because they delayed benefits until 70, Social Security served as a great safety net for that added longevity. It's almost as if Social Security was intended to be insurance. But we'll talk more about that another time. And one last data point that we will tamper with. Up until now, we've been assuming a rate of return of 8%. But let's say that Steve and Susie are the average American with a large brokerage firm, paying about 1% more in fees than they ought to be. So they're not spending any more, they're not retiring any longer, but how much more do they need now? Rather than the original 1.6 million, now they need about 1.76, about 160 grand more. And let's take that one step further and say Steve and Susie are getting a little tired of riding the market ups and downs, and they choose to move more of their portfolio out of the market, which is their prerogative, and this lowers their returns by another percent. Now they're earning more like 6% instead of our original 8%. So how much do they need now? Well, we went from 1.6 to 1.76, and now at 6% return, they need about $1.94 million. That is how much they would need to have saved instead. So those are just some numbers that I thought it might be helpful to have tangible examples of. If you have another situation you would like me to run, just let me know. Now, I do want to take a moment and think about everything these calculations are not factoring in. Namely, taxation. Our sample numbers would be great if all these assets were in a tax-free Roth account. Now, I hope that's not the case, just for the sake of their own tax efficiency. But if we were to doctor that number up a bit to make it a little more accurate, we might consider the portion of their portfolio that has yet to be taxed and tack on their expected tax rate. So back to the baseline example, if Steve and Susie are needing income of $10K a month, assume that most of that still needs to be taxed. Maybe their tax rate is about 12%. And that initial need of $1.6 million becomes $1.8 million. If you want to get really fancy at this stage, you can even add on your state and local taxes as well. Another thing to point out is that we've only really included monthly expenses, which could include vacation. That could include trips, but it probably doesn't include if you were to buy a second home. It probably doesn't include needing to buy a car every 8 to 10 years or so. My point is, there's obviously a lot to consider when it comes to estimating your retirement need. And the variables are going to vary considerably for each of us. A present value calculation is not going to get it right. But it can help as we get closer to what is right for us. Because it does give us a number that we can then further manipulate as we continue to think through our own situation. And that is what I leave you with today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.